In the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, closer to Greenland than to mainland Europe, there is an island where volcanoes erupt beneath glaciers, where the ground breathes steam, and where the sun disappears for months at a time. No army has ever conquered it, no foreign power has ever taken it by force, and the people who live there today speak almost the exact same language as the men and women who arrived over 1100 years ago. How does a nation get founded in the middle of nowhere? What kind of people choose to sail into the unknown and never come back? And how does a society with no king, no standing army, and no central government survive for centuries and still leave a mark on the entire Western world? The story of Iceland begins not with Iceland, but with Norway. In the 9th century, Norway was a patchwork of small kingdoms and territories ruled by local chieftains. These were men who measured power in land, cattle, and loyal followers. They settled disputes with swords. They built alliances through marriage, and they answered to no one above them. Then came a king who wanted to change all of that. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for your support, and now, let's continue. Harald Fairhair spent the better part of his reign, from around 870 to 930, absorbing those small kingdoms one by one. He fought battles, made examples of resistors, and demanded that every chieftain in Norway bend the knee. For men who had been independent all their lives, this was not just a political inconvenience. It was an existential humiliation. Some submitted, others left. The people who left pointed their longships west, into waters that most Europeans of the time had never crossed. Some stopped at the Faroe Islands. Others pushed further, following stories told by sailors about a large island far out in the ocean. Cold, volcanic, and completely empty. Irish monks had been there before the Norse arrived. The monk Dicuil, writing around 825, described islands in the Northern Sea where monks had lived for roughly 100 years. When Norse settlers began arriving in numbers, the monks departed. They had no interest in sharing their solitude with pagans. The first Norse explorer to circle the island and name it was a Swede named Gardar Svafarsson, who arrived around 860 and called it Gardarsholmur, Gardar's Island. After him came Hrafna Floki, a Norwegian who brought ravens with him to use as navigation tools, releasing them to fly in search of land. He wintered on the island, lost all his cattle to the cold, and left in the spring, calling it Iceland. He did not come back. But Ingolfur Arnason came back. Ingolfur was a Norwegian chieftain from Sunnfjord on the western coast of Norway. Born around 849, he was a man of resources, a landowner with followers, tools, animals, and the means to organize a major expedition. He had also, according to the sagas, become involved in a blood feud that made staying in Norway a dangerous proposition. In 874, Ingolfur Arnason loaded his ships with his wife Halvai Frodadotter, his foster brother Hjorleifur Hrodmarsson, family members, servants, slaves, cattle, horses, and the carved wooden pillars of his high seat, the symbol of the Norse household, the physical embodiment of the family's claim to a place in the world. When Iceland came into view on the horizon, Ingolfur did something that every Norse man and woman watching would have understood immediately. He threw the high seat pillars into the sea and swore that he would settle wherever the gods decided the pillars should come ashore. His slaves searched the coastline for 3 years. When the pillars were finally found in a bay on the southwestern coast, steam rising from hot springs along the shore, Ingolfur kept his oath. He built his farm there. He called the place Reykjavik, the Smoky Bay. That farm became the capital of Iceland. Over the following decades, the island filled with people. The Book of Settlements, compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries, lists more than 400 original settlers by name and documents, over 3,000 individuals, and 1,400 locations. Estimates of the total number of migrants during the settlement period, 874 to 930, range from 4,000 to 24,000 people. Most came from southwestern Norway. Others came from Norse settlements in Ireland and Scotland, bringing with them Celtic wives, Celtic slaves, and Celtic cultural traces that survive in Icelandic genetics and place names to this day. They brought everything a civilization needed: sheep and cattle, horses, tools, seeds, traditions, and stories. They cleared land, built longhouses, and began the slow work of turning a volcanic island into a home. What they deliberately did not bring was a king. In 930, the chieftains of Iceland gathered on the plains of Thingvellir, the assembly fields, about 40 kilometers northeast of what is now Reykjavik, and founded the Althing. The Althing was not a monarchy. It was not a feudal hierarchy. It was a national assembly, the world's oldest surviving parliament, where the 39 district chieftains, known as the Godha, met every June for 2 weeks to legislate, resolve disputes, and hear legal cases. A man named Ulfliot had spent 3 years in Norway studying its legal code specifically to bring a framework back to Iceland. At the centre of the gathering stood the Law Rock, where the law speaker, an elected official serving a 3-year term, recited 1/3 of the entire legal code allowed each year, from memory, so that every free man in attendance could hear and know the laws that governed his life. There was no executive branch, no standing army, no one man with the power to compel obedience by force. All free men could attend. They came on horseback from every corner of the island, camped along the valley for 2 weeks, conducted business, arranged marriages, settled vendettas, and listened to storytellers. The Althing was simultaneously a parliament, a court, a market, and the single largest social event of the Icelandic year. A chieftain's authority depended entirely on the voluntary loyalty of his followers, who could transfer that loyalty to another chieftain at will. It was a system built on consensus, persuasion, and the constant management of relationships. In 1000, Iceland faced its first existential crisis. The Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, newly converted to Christianity, sent missionaries to Iceland and pressured the island to abandon the Norse gods, Thor, Odin, Freyr, and adopt the Christian faith. He held Icelandic hostages at his court as leverage. He threatened to cut off trade. The Althing of the year 1000 was on the brink of civil war. Christian Icelanders and pagan Icelanders were preparing to fight each other. The man who prevented that war was himself a pagan. The law speaker, Thorgeir Thorkelson, was asked by both sides to decide the island's religious future. He withdrew under a fur blanket and lay in silence for a full day and night. When he emerged, he announced that Iceland would adopt Christianity as its official religion, but that pagans could continue their worship privately. It was a compromise that saved no one's pride and everyone's lives. Iceland became Christian, and the Althing survived. From the 10th through the 12th centuries, Iceland produced something remarkable, a body of literature in its own vernacular language that has no real parallel in medieval Europe. The Icelandic sagas were written between the 12th and 14th centuries with a psychological precision and narrative economy that strikes modern readers as almost impossibly sophisticated. The prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson, written around 1220, remains the single most important source for Norse mythology. Without it, modern knowledge of Thor, Odin, Loki, and the Norse cosmology would be a fraction of what it is. The Njals saga, the Egils saga, the Laxdæla saga, each one a detailed portrait of how power, land, family, and honor intersected in a society that had no king. But while the sagas were being written, the Republic was rotting from the inside. Through the 12th and 13th centuries, power that had once been distributed among dozens of chieftains began concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. Richer chieftains absorbed the domains of weaker ones. By 1220, 6 families controlled most of Iceland. The most powerful of them was the Sturlunga clan. The defining figure of the era was Snorri Sturluson, chieftain, twice law speaker of the Althing, and the greatest writer Iceland ever produced. He played a dangerous political game between the Icelandic factions and the Norwegian king Hakon IV, who was using the civil war as an opportunity to extend his influence over the island. Snorri miscalculated. In September 1241, men sent by his former ally Gissur Thorvaldsson surrounded his home at Reykholt before dawn. Snorri was found hiding in a cellar. His last recorded words were, "Do not strike." They struck. 21 years after Snorri's death, the exhausted Icelandic chieftains signed the Old Covenant and submitted to the Norwegian crown. In 1262, 332 years after its founding, the Icelandic Commonwealth ended. Not by conquest. No foreign army had ever landed in Iceland and won a battle. The submission was a choice made by people too depleted by their own wars to continue. Under Norwegian rule, and then under Danish rule from 1380, the Althing continued to meet, but as a shadow of its former self, a court that administered foreign law rather than a parliament that made its own. In 1602, the Danish king Christian IV imposed a trade monopoly that prohibited Icelanders from trading with any nation except Denmark. Foreign merchants who had supplied the island for centuries were banned. Prices rose. Quality of imported goods fell. Iceland entered a period of economic strangulation that lasted nearly 2 centuries. And natural disasters compounded the misery. In 1707, a smallpox epidemic killed between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire population. In 1783, the Laki volcanic fissure erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human history, releasing gases that poisoned pastureland, killed 80% of Iceland's livestock, and triggered a famine that killed roughly 1/4 of the surviving population. Copenhagen debated whether to evacuate the entire island and abandon it. They did not. Iceland was not evacuated. Its people survived. The independence movement that emerged in the 19th century drew on something that no other colonial people in Europe possessed with the same depth. A continuous literary and linguistic tradition stretching back over 900 years, still readable without a specialized dictionary. Intellectuals like Jon Sigurdsson, born in 1811, trained in Copenhagen, deeply versed in Icelandic legal history, argued that the Danish king had no authority to grant or withhold Icelandic rights, because those rights derived from the Althing and from a tradition of self-governance that predated the Danish connection entirely. His arguments, circulated in journals and petitions through the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, built the intellectual foundation for every subsequent step toward independence. In 1874, exactly 1,000 years after the first settlement, Denmark granted Iceland its first constitution and limited home rule. In 1918, Iceland became a sovereign state in personal union with Denmark. In 1944, while German forces occupied Denmark and the connection between the two countries had effectively dissolved, Iceland held a referendum. 98% of voters chose independence. On June 17, 1944, the birthday of Jon Sigurdsson, the Republic of Iceland was proclaimed at Thingvellir, on the same plains where the Althing had first met over 1,000 years earlier. No army had ever conquered Iceland, no foreign power had ever taken it by force, and the parliament founded in 930 still meets today, the oldest surviving parliamentary institution in the world. The Icelandic language spoken today is so close to the Old Norse of the 9th century that a modern Icelander can read the original sagas without a specialized dictionary. No other living language has preserved its medieval form with that degree of fidelity. It survived because the island survived, alone, cold, and stubbornly itself, for over 1,100 years.